Ready?
And I can either do that for you or you can.
Oh,
sorry,
sure.
we don't-
Yeah, I may. See how it goes. So yeah, hi everybody. I'm Andrew Meyers. I'm District Wildlife Biologist for Oregon Fish and Wildlife out of the Dalles. I actually live here in Hood River, but the area that we cover is Sherman, Wasco, and Hood River counties, for the most part. I grew up in the gorge, actually grew up in Carson on the other side of the river. Both my parents were in natural resources. My mom worked for the Forest Service, dad for Washington Fish and Wildlife, and that kind of what got me into it. I went to school at University of Idaho, did the kind of seasonal biologist thing and traveled all over the US working with a bunch of different species, mostly birds, sage grouse, prairie chickens, a lot of waterfowl work. Did my master's in New Mexico on lesser prairie chickens, and then came back, or actually spent a bunch of time in Idaho again, and then came back here to Oregon about 3 years ago. I started right when COVID hit, so it was an interesting time. But yeah, have been the assistant biologist and just became the district biologist here about a year ago. So that's kind of my brief background, and I'm gonna talk to you today about watershed group asked me to come give a talk about deer in the Hood River watershed, kind of I'll just say the Hood River Valley. And the deer we have here are black-tailed deer, so gonna hop into it. Ooh, which button do I hit? There. Hey, there you go. Just kind of something back up. There we go. Just an outline of kind of what I'll talk about. I'll go over species overview, just to kind of get all of us on the same page. Talk about the population here, numbers in Hood River Valley. Briefly kind of go over our management, just to kind of set up a few studies that we did here over the last couple of years to improve our efforts to monitor black-tailed deer. Turns out they're really hard to count and get a handle on. Talk a little bit about migration in the area, and then go over a couple conservation issues. I actually have water conservation issues on there, but recreation issues are probably the main thing that I'm talking about. So black-tailed deer, what makes them different than any other kind of deer? So I guess I'll kind of maybe open it up to people in the room. So what are the three kind of main deer species that we have in the US?
Whitetail, black-tailed deer.
Got it. Perfect. So those are the three. So most of our whitetail, kind of the East Coast species. Mule deer are what we have once you start getting over to Eastern Oregon. Columbian black-tailed deer, there's several subspecies of black-tailed deer, but Columbian black-tailed deer we have here, and they're actually a subspecies of mule deer. So very closely related. What makes them different? They're a little bit smaller than mule deer. The tail's a little bit different looking. And then bucks tend to have smaller antlers and a forking pattern that looks a little bit different than whitetail. So here's kind of three pictures on the left. You got white-tailed deer, is actually a subspecies that lives here in Oregon. Black-tailed deer in the middle, and you can see, I'll kind of highlight, I guess I'll just stand here.
Andrew, as much as you can talk at that little owl, I know it's a really weird.
Sure, I might just stand right here if that's okay.
Yeah.
I'm close to it. So just looking at the tail, you can see the difference from left, center, and right. Whereas black-tail kind of have that all black colored tail all the way down, unlike mule deer or whitetail. And then
Quick question.
sure.
So, locally within Oregon and Washington, are the mule deer and black-tailed deer populations entirely distinct, or is there a lot of?
There's a lot of overlap. Like I guess the best way to think about it in my mind is it's kind of a gradient where you're starting right about here, going all the way over to the Deschutes River. And once you get east of the Deschutes River, it starts to become more what I would say pure or more mule deer characteristics, and everything in between. It's kind of a mix depending on where you're at. So you do see characteristics of both. The other big thing is like, I guess would be to point out the antlers. The white-tailed deer comes off a single beam. Black-tail and mule deer both fork. They fork once and then fork again usually. Mule deer have much bigger antlers in general once they get mature than black-tailed deer do. So here's kind of thing you were alluding to. This map shows the distribution of blacktail and mule deer, along with our wildlife management units. So anything in gray is considered black-tailed deer for our management, Oregon Fish and Wildlife. Anything in white we consider mule deer, but that hash section in the middle is where we see this overlap where you kind of get a little bit of both.
Is the boundary between the blacktail and the hash mark, is that the Pacific Crest Trail or the?
It's in general the crest of the Cascades. It gets a little goofy in there. So just kind of basic life history. This goes for most deer, and most of you probably already know this, but I'll kind of walk through and highlight a few things to consider when thinking about them. So we'll kind of start out in June. That's when fawns are born. Obviously, they're highly susceptible to predation for the first couple weeks, and then honestly into the next several months. But they don't really move around a whole lot those first couple weeks. So the big thing is once they are born is they do have to seek out, both moms and the fawns have to seek out forage to get resources before the winter. It's kind of the whole lead up. We do have breeding season, which most hunters will know is the rut from late October through November. And at best, this is kind of the big thing with all deer species. Is they maintain or lose body weight over the winter. So the best you can hope for is that you're gonna maintain. So that's why summer and fall are really important to gain that body fat that it's gonna carry them through the winter. Blacktail, kind of mule deer, I don't know how much people know about them, but like there's some really cool studies out of Wyoming where they're making these crazy migrations that are 90 miles long. Blacktail really aren't like that. It's more of just top of the hill to the bottom of the hill for most of their migrations. We do have some longer ones in Oregon, but in general around here, it's an elevational migration. So we move down to lower elevation in winter, go back up slope in the spring to exploit those resources higher. And then we're back to the beginning. Fawns are born again in June. So that's just kind of a brief life history, but the big thing to think about is how critical that winter is, being able to get through that for their survival. Habitat needs, basic habitat needs for all wildlife, food, water, shelter for the most part. Black-tailed deer, unlike their mule deer counterparts, are more adapted to dense canopy forests. They kind of use it for seclusion and to stay hidden from predators. But counterintuitively, they do prefer to do most of their foraging in open canopy or open canopy areas. The main thing being they're trying to eat everything down on the ground, so light has to be able to get down to that food for them to get any, or the food to get nutritious enough for them to benefit from it. Deer are browsers, so unlike you might think of like cattle or elk, they can eat a bunch of low quality forage and get by on that. Deer have to be really picky, and they usually eat the highest quality stuff out there, which tend to be stems and leaves. They will eat forage seasonally when available. And again, just highlight, they do need the best quality forage they can get. So openings created by fire and timber harvest can actually be really beneficial for them. They're considered an edge species, so that basically means that they live on that edge where they're going into the open areas to forage, but they're going back to that canopy to provide cover from predators. But I thought, I guess probably most folks in this room might know a little bit about this, but go over a little bit of brief history and how that's kind of impacted black-tailed deer here in the West Coast. So going all the way back to probably some of our, at least European, earliest recorded reports of black-tailed deer. So if you read Lewis and Clark's journals, they actually talk about running into less game as they got closer to the coast and spent the winter at Fort Clatsop. Which is interesting to me. I guess growing up on the Washington side there in the early 1990s, logging practices, or at least I noticed we had really good deer hunting. That was in part due to logging practices throughout the mid-1900s. Obviously, we cut a lot of timber, created a lot of open spaces. There was a lot of practice of burning after those timber harvests too, which released a bunch of nutrients and created high quality forage for those deer. Consequently saw a big population increase, and that was seen mostly through hunter harvest. Policies were reversed in the early 1990s. So harvest precipitously dropped on federal lands. And clear cuts from the 1980s and 1990s and earlier start to get to that dense stage where they're choking out everything and there wasn't much of an understory. So consequently, that's caused some decline in black-tailed deer. So this graph is out of our actually black-tailed deer management plan. It's just showing hunter harvest over since the 1960s to close to present day. As you can see, we were total harvest was right around 60,000 back in the 60s, kind of had its ups and downs. And I guess the thing to highlight here, I put a line, that's when the Northwest Forest Plan was enacted, and basically you just kind of see since then, we've had a lot of changes in our season structures that have also impacted that, but big drop off in terms of harvest.
And is this everywhere on both private forest land and federal?
So these numbers are all at the state level, but, yeah, I can definitely get into that maybe towards the end of it, but there are some differences between private and, public lands. So population status is the question I get asked about black-tailed deer all the time. How many deer do we have? Really hard to measure, for a bunch of reasons that I'll get into here in a second. Our black-tailed deer management plan said we had 452,000, and I would say that's a pretty big guess back in the 1970s, 1974. 320,000 by 2004 in terms of numbers. So a little bit of a decline, but not anything.
What does BTD stand for?
Black-tailed deer, sorry.
Oh, okay, sorry. Everybody else got that.
What's the geographic area for that?
This is just the state of Oregon. Yep, so this is right out of our management plan, so just for Oregon. Obviously they occur in Washington and California too. So we're always trying to figure out better ways to count them. Most of the numbers, that have been come up with back in the days were, through harvest. A lot of times we look at hunter harvest and use that as kind of an index of the population. We have more deer harvest, we think we have more deer. New methods they're trying, at least that our department's trying to work on are using fecal DNA. So basically what they do is they can collect poop off the ground using humans and scat detecting dogs. And when they run that through a DNA sequence, they can get basically a barcode for that individual. So they can do like a lot of wildlife work. We do mark recaptured estimate populations. And using DNA, they can get unique individuals and try to develop an estimate based on that. They've been working on that since 2012 and there's still limited answers. I tried to dig through a bunch before this presentation just to find some information on it from our department. This is the best that I've come up with. So some of the estimates that they've come up with, and these are kind of present day. And it gets at what you were asking there, Cindy. In terms of deer density, so deer per kilometer squared. On federal lands, 3.9 all the way up to on large private. That's when it says small private and large private, that's industrial timber. 9 to 10 deer per square mile. So you can see that difference in forest structure and openings really has an impact on the number of deer in an area.
That's about right too, 'cause I live right among them.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a good figure, those seem, from where on the east side, I live on the east side of the river.
Yeah, and they did this in 3 different wildlife management units and the coast. I think they did some in the Coast Range and some in the Cascades. And so it's kind of a mix over
So
there.
I'm in what used to be commercial forest and now it's a private individual, but my view from my front deck is about a square kilometer.
Yeah,
And there's about 10 does and a few bucks living there.
there you go. All right, well, I'll let them know they're close then.
They must have read your book.
Yeah. So I guess maybe at least in the room, quick, maybe show of hand, any among you hunters or partake in that? So I know that you a little bit.
Sorry, everybody.
No, I guess I'll just go over it kind of at least briefly in terms of Oregon Fish and Wildlife. Our big management tool is hunting in terms of population, either control or just to provide recreational opportunity for most folks. So the 2 primary metrics that we use in our management plan, or that we measure on an annual basis or try to measure, I should say, population size and herd composition. And herd composition is basically trying to compare the difference or the percentage of sex and age class we have with certain individuals. So the two that we use are fawns per doe, or fawns, we usually would do it for 100. So fawns per 100 does, we try to have 35 going into the spring. And that's basically saying that, you know, we had a reproductive or a fecundity rate of 35%. And that'll carry us through the next year with a relatively stable population. The other one we use, and this is more for the hunting metric, is bucks per doe. And that basically is a measure of the amount of, again, bucks that are available for harvest. So for the local area, we try to have 25 bucks per 100 does is our management objectives.
That's a lot
Yep, that's a pretty good number.
compared to Eastern Oregon, units, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah, and it ranges throughout the state. 25 is as high as we go. There's other places that are at 10 or 15, or 12 or 15, I should say. So other things, I guess the things that we try to kind of keep tabs on, hunting, subsistence harvest with the tribes. Another thing that comes into our playbook is damage. So we do have to address damage, or we have an obligation to deal with that. We try to keep tabs on disease in these populations because that can have huge impacts. We've actually seen that a little bit locally as well. Weather conditions, so as I mentioned, winter's a really hard time for them. If we do have a harsh winter, that can really impact populations. Habitat condition, that kind of goes into some of those forest openings versus closure situations. And then public values, you know, what do people want? Do people want more deer, less deer? Be able to go out and see them every day, that sort of thing. So I'm gonna kind of shift gears. It's a very blurry figure. Don't worry too much about the numbers up there. So since it's so hard to count and kind of monitor deer in the area, we've been working locally, or at least since I've got here, on some new ways to do that, utilizing trail cameras. So the big thing I wanted to draw your attention to on this one, so these are the 5 units or 4 areas that we manage. And as you can see, there's a bunch of blank spots over there on the left. Those are the metrics that I talked about. So we have population, bucks per 100 does, and fawns per 100 does. And you can see there's a big blank spot for the Hood unit, which is where we're at. We really haven't had great success at measuring that, or even been able to do it very well the last several years. And then just to give you guys reference, so I'm going to talk a lot about the Hood Wildlife Management Unit. There, the star up there is where we're at. This is Mount Hood. That's kind of the level that we manage at. So basically, everything to the west of Highway 35 is what's in that wildlife management unit. Technically, for the Hood River Valley, we do encompass some of that. This is what we call the White River unit on the west slope of the Hood River Valley too. So how do we count big game, deer and elk? Most of the methods in Oregon and for the longest time have been through aerial surveys, which kind of explains why we don't have great numbers over here. There are some ground-based methods that are used in Western Oregon, primarily spotlight surveys, where you drive a road, you'll count the number of deer and you can get that ratio of fawns, depending on how many fawns, bucks, and does you have. And just to kind of highlight what that looks like, it works really great on the eastern half of the area that I'm in. You can see, obviously, I'm sure many of you have been out in the wheat fields there. There's a couple here kind of in the lower center there. Super easy to count from the road. Gets a little bit more challenging when you get into this part of the world, but you can still see them from the ground depending on if you have some openings. This is kind of like what we get to look at from the air, obviously not here, but pretty cool. But as you can imagine, that's what we're looking at when we get into the Hood River area. So again, what's been done in the past, we've had limited nighttime spotlighting surveys. Those have got all kinds of challenges with them. Sometimes you go out and you don't see anything. Sometimes it's really hard to see what you're looking at. You get just a pair of eyes and a spotlight, and it's really difficult to tell if it's a doe or a buck or a fawn. And then we've really had no way to estimate population. We've always kind of assumed that it trended with the White River unit, which is the unit directly to the east. And that's how we base most of our numbers.
So the aerial surveys, have you tried using
infrared to,
There have been places that have used that with limited or varying success. Some people have had success with it, but in general, it seems like it's really hard to see through, even like when you have a dense stud fir canopy still. So as far as I know, nobody's had that one work too well. But basically, when I got here, I was tasked with trying to figure out a way to make this work. Coming from Idaho, they had been using trail cameras to do a lot of this work, so just kind of a standard remote camera that you tie onto a tree or whatever, and as something walks by, it'll take a picture. So my objectives, at least when I got here, I kind of go through several things I've done, but compare camera trap methods to aerial methods for estimating population, see if we could even make it work. So basically try to put those cameras out in White River where we do fly and see if we get a number that's even remotely close to what the cameras give us. Wanted to compare price to traditional methods, just because, Idaho had found that it was actually cheaper, so I kind of wanted to record that. And then, you know, the more challenging thing, or one of the ones that hasn't been done as much, is trying to use those camera traps to also get that herd composition number, so number of bucks, number of does, number of fawns, as well. So instead of going through and doing tests like I intended, we kind of jumped right into it. In 2020 when I arrived here. So this is a map showing our sampling efforts in 2020 to put out trail cameras and do a population estimate for the Hood Wildlife Management Unit. So each of those crosses up there represents a cell that we selected and placed a trail camera in. When I got here, we only had 25, I think we had 30 trail cameras, if you count those crosses. So we split it into 3 different areas, and we did basically 2-week deployments in 3 different areas. So it took us all summer to get these, you know, about a week to deploy, 2 weeks out, a week to pull them, and then a week to deploy, a week to pull them at each site. So it took us all summer to do this. Probably not, like I said, it would have been nice to test this and then do it, but we went for it. I guess I won't go to, I'm happy to go into the methods if people want to. So there's a couple different, I guess, analyses you can do that will give you an estimate. And I'll kind of go to, I guess, real briefly. So there's one called an instantaneous sampler, space to event model, and a time to event model. The unique thing about these two, the space to event and the instantaneous sampler, is that they rely on time-lapse photos. So you set your camera to take a photo like every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes or something like that. And it uses those types of photos to develop an estimate. The time to event model uses motion trigger photos, or just whenever anything walks in front of it, it'll take a picture. So they all produce slightly different estimates, and that was one of the challenges when I got here, is trying to figure out which of those 3 produce the best. As you can see, so on the left, this is the total number of animals that we estimated in the hood. So the square represents the actual point estimate, and then we always give a kind of a range around that. So you can see pretty wide ranges, anywhere from up to, I don't know, 2,700 down to 500 animals, so pretty broad range. Instantaneous sampling and space event gave us 2 kind of on the lower end, and then that timed event, a little bit wider confidence interval and higher estimate. We ended up kind of averaging these 2 lower ones, since they were closer together, and had been, at least according to previous or other researchers, the more reliable methods. So we estimated about 1,300 a year, and we only, if you know, I could even go back and show you. You'll probably notice on this photo, we didn't include some of the actual Hood River Valley area there, the private lands. So this was just on public lands for that estimate. Quick price comparison. Aerial survey methods. So we did a survey that same year in the White River unit, and it cost us about $42,000 in flight time and personnel time. Price per personnel. And it took us about 370 hours, and that's personnel hours. So that's, you know, several people working a couple weeks. With the camera traps, it took us more personnel hours. So that's hiking out to each of those points. We had some fun hikes out in the Eagle Creek Burn and a lot of those wilderness areas. So that took longer, but it cost us only $28,000. And then that was including one-time costs like buying the cameras, and so once you get rid of those one-time costs, it actually drops it down to, we repeat the survey about $15,400, and that's mostly personnel time. I will skip through this. I actually pulled some of these out of other talks. This is a breakdown of all those. If you're interested, I'd be happy to go into it, but it's not terribly, probably relevant. So the next step, kind of in reverse order what it should have been, winter of 2020, spring of 2021, we decided to test this method and see if it compared well to our aerial surveys. So again, we use the White River unit, the unit directly to the east of us here for that comparison. And we focused in on one kind of a small area, so it was doable with basically 2 people. So that area down there, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Smock Prairie on the White River Wildlife area, but that's where that's at. So that's the area we chose for this kind of test. Just to zoom in, White River Wildlife Area owns it. It's dissected by this area right here is the White River Canyon. So that's kind of on the south end of it. So we placed 10, I believe 10 cameras or 15 cameras, it looks like. 15 cameras in there. It would have been spring, so February 2021. And then this is kind of this dash here shows our flight track. So we also flew a survey about that time. And each of those little dots and numbers represents a group of deer that we counted and how many deer were in that group. And here's the results from that. Again, we have the same, kind of not the best labels down here on the bottom, but this is the timed event, the spaced event, the instantaneous sampler, and these 2 are the ones that use those time-lapse photos to get an estimate. And then these dash lines running across, so this dash kind of focus on this black one, that's the raw count of deer that we saw. So we counted a little over 100, about 110 deer in that small area. And we did get pretty good agreement with that instantaneous sampler survey or kind of analysis method. So that's kind of the one, I guess, going from here on out that I would put a little more faith in. It's also of those, the easiest to explain how it works.
So that's the camera data or flight data?
It's got both on it. So this line here is the flight. This is our estimate from the flight.
Okay.
So about 100 deer, and I just put that on there so you can see if there's overlap with these lines. So the point estimate, so this is our estimate for how many deer we had with using the cameras. And these are just 3 different methods of analyzing that data. So this is kind of the one to focus in on there. We found one method out of those 3 that seems to give us a good estimate. Kind of like the Goldilocks one. You got one a little high, one a little low, and that one's just right.
So the Hood River population estimate that you gave us was not based on the instantaneous sample,
No,
right?
it was
So-
based on these 2, and I came up,
So,
when I came up with that one, yeah, it would be good to go back and revise that to probably, and I think go back and look at it. I want to say they were both pretty close. One was slightly lower, I think.
Wouldn't the flight data be way less accurate in the units because of all the cover?
It would, and that's why we haven't flown the video. So this was in the White River, yeah, yeah. No, we haven't even tried to fly the hood unit because we'd spend $40,000 to fly and look at trees all day, which would be cool for pure
Most
forester, I
local
guess.
hunters, they're dreaded. One of the worst things that could happen to you is get a hood tag. They don't like to hunt hood. Because they're nocturnal during deer
Oh,
season, you just don't see them.
oh, yeah.
It's not that they're not there, but you just won't see them.
Yep, no, they're there, and that's what makes our job super hard, is trying to find them to count them. I'll kind of go through this real quick. This was a test that we actually did just recently this year. I just gave a different talk on this at a conference here in Hood River, but this was trying to estimate those herd composition numbers. So even though we're counting the total population with that other method, it's just counting number of deer. It's not telling us how many does there are, how many fawns there are, how many bucks. So this method, we're trying to get it at that. So again, we did the same thing. We basically flew an area and got an estimate how we normally would get it. And then we also put cameras out and did a comparison that way. So we used 2 different study areas this time to kind of have one replication of it. We did that Smock area down on the south or kind of lower part of the screen there. And then we did a place postage stamp view if you're familiar with that area. Both on White River Wildlife Area. It's nice to have somewhere that we have access and just put cameras wherever. And just for reference, we're all up there. I can go into kind of the methods of how we put this out. So in the Hood area, when we've done herd comp estimates over here, we try to put one, or basically we only have enough cameras to put one every between 4.5 and 8 square miles. So it's a pretty, or one camera's covering a pretty big area. We did it at a higher density at both of those two study sites, just because we have the ability and we can always pull a couple cameras out of the analysis to try to compare that if we want. When we put the cameras out, we generate random points. We make sure they're at least 100 yards away from the edge of the survey area, and then one camera was the closest that it could be was 400 meters to one another, so about a quarter mile apart. Observers, so myself and a bunch of other ODFW folks went out and put cameras, tried to put it within 100 yards of the random point that they were given. Wanted to put it in a location where it's most likely to capture the highest number of individual deer, unique deer, so we're not getting, basically putting it on like a trail or somewhere that looks like a natural traffic corridor. I don't know how many folks have put out trail cameras, but some of the basics are things that we've learned over time. Try not to face them into the sun, so face them north instead of south. Had several with those issues. No objects within several feet in front of the camera. If you get it'll use an infrared light and it actually will light up, say, a tree or something. You'll just see a set of eyes behind it. So try to use some of those stipulations to get accurate pictures. Clear a bunch of brush so you don't get wind moving it.
Were they in locked boxes or not?
We have locks around the trees to make sure they can't steal them, but if somebody really wants to, they can bring a bolt
So
cutter.
did you have any that were stolen?
I've only had a couple stolen over the whole time of putting out cameras.
Cause I never had any locks and I had 2 stolen on the same spring on the old Dells Road.
Yeah.
Ended my trail cam career. I bought cheap ones, I knew, so I didn't buy real expensive ones.
Yeah, most of these, I mean, we're putting them in places too, they're random points.
You gotta have a
Walking
fast
point
enough
over
trigger
that.
speed to catch them. The cheap ones have a slow trigger speed and that
Yep.
will miss more than hit.
Yeah, we use Reconyx cameras, they're definitely not cheap.
So you had to go get your SD cards or did you use remote? Were you remote?
We had to go retrieve them, yeah, to do the remote.
Cause you were too far away, it wouldn't have worked.
Yeah, that's part of the issue in cell service, so there are
They're
ones
more
that'll
expensive.
send you photos directly with cell service. We didn't have cell service, we couldn't use them, they're a little more expensive, you also gotta pay to
There's
get all the
subscription.
photos. So this worked out plenty well for what we needed to put out the ones you actually go recover.
You have a way of knowing whether you're photographing the same deer multiple times, just, this is the path it likes to take and this.
Oh, yeah, that's where, so nobody else is trying to figure this out, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges. We definitely get the same animal, over and over again. I've talked to some of our statisticians and their kind of general thoughts on it are, you're still getting a sample, even if you're counting the same. Basically, if you're counting the same buck over and over again, you're in the same home range as another doe and you hopefully count them over and over again. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but that's what we're trying to get at with this test is like, do we get a crazy high amount of bucks because it's rut and they're running through the camera over and over again? We did our flight. We had cameras out before and after that flight for 2 weeks, so total of 4 weeks, sample period. We broke these images down into what I call detection events. So basically it's a set of triggered photos, with at least 1 hour dead space between the next set of photos. So for example, if deer was detected at 8 AM and then detected again at 8:10 AM, that would be the same event. If there's another deer detected at 9:30 AM, that would be over an hour later, so that's a new event. And for each of these event sequences, it also helps get at that, trying not to count the same one over and over again. If it sits there and goes one way and then 2 minutes comes back the other way. For each event, we counted the number of bucks, does, and fawns, for that event, total number of unique deer. And then we had to use, observers use their best judgment. I actually did compare this with one of, my other coworkers, we both did them independently and looked, and we were actually amazingly close with our assessments on how many deer are in each of those classes for these detection events. So you had to use your best judgment for the same deer walking in and out of the view shed over and over again. And if you're unable to see an individual well enough, we just called it unknown and threw that photo out. So this is just an example of what that might look like. So, doesn't have the date and time, but I think this whole sequence takes place in about 2 minutes. You have an individual doe walking through, somebody else following her. And then all of a sudden, another, this is like, I can't see the time, but a few seconds later, a buck walks in and follows her through. So that detection event, we would have had 3 deer, it had 2 different does and 1 buck. So we did that for hours and hours. So again, these cameras are set up to take a motion trigger photo, 3 photos per trigger, super high sensitivity, so we get those sequences that are in short duration like that. Another thing we did was had it take 1 time-lapse photo at 9 AM each day, just to make sure that the camera was still functioning. I've done this before where you have a camera that the battery died midway through and you have no idea when it died. Because some of these cameras, they only detect deer maybe once or twice throughout that 4-week period. If you're ever doing, I guess it's just kind of, if you ever do this yourself, lithium batteries are pretty critical. They work way better. And then we had big enough SD cards to hold all the information. So this is the results of that we just got done here a couple weeks ago. So with our area, these are the 2 different study areas, postage stamp and smock. And with our aerial estimate, we had, for buck ratio, so that's that number of 25 bucks per 100 does. We were spot on at that number with the aerial methods. And then with cameras, we actually estimated a little bit higher buck ratio. So maybe we had some of that multiple, the same buck walking through and skewing that upwards. But we did have, these intervals, we like to see that these overlap, means that we're at least somewhat similar. So we had pretty good agreement there. The other one, a little bit less so. This was out of Smock Prairie. Aerial method, we said 10 bucks for 100 does. And the cameras gave us a little bit higher estimate and much bigger spread on that number, 25 bucks per 100 does. So cameras, basically, we see a little bit of overestimation, it seems like.
Is there more cover at the smock unit, smock prairie?
So both of them are pretty open, which is why we chose them. It's kind of like open oak understory type stuff. For fawn ratio, which is the one that we're interested in, just to see how much production we had for that year. At postage stamp, it was spot on. We had the exact same number with our aerial and our camera count. And then at Smock Prairie, we had a little bit higher number with the aerial count and a little bit lower number, but again, we see those intervals overlapping, which means we've pretty good confidence that they're at least close. So it's pretty good results. We've had a couple different shows now, and it does seem like we can get at least somewhat repeatable results using cameras. So again, just quick conclusions on those. Cameras do seem to provide valid estimates. I would like to see science requires multiple replicates of something, so you're gonna see that done a couple times to give us a little more confidence in it. And then I think there's possible expansion to other areas. I've actually talked to biologists on the other side of the hill in Clackamas, and they're using the same method or trying it out this year as well. So that's kind of cool to see. So I'll kind of jump into a couple of quick conservation issues with the Hood River Valley. So now we're able to get a little bit better handle on deer numbers and the composition of them. Hopefully we can start, at least over time, monitoring the impacts of some of these issues that you all, I'm sure, are very familiar with and deal with. So first we'll talk about winter range, challenges and migration for black-tailed deer, agricultural conflict, recreation impacts. So basically in the Hood River Valley, from a biologist perspective, I look at it, we have pretty limited winter range here. Historically, the deer would have come down to lower elevations, and guess what? That's where we all like to live. So it does provide a bit of a challenge. So deer and other wildlife migrate to avoid the impacts of a harsh winter, and we're living right where they want to be in the winter. They're also at those lower elevations, they still need those openings with forage and thermal cover. So like those dense canopy forests, not only do they provide cover in the winter, but they also, or from predators rather, but they also provide thermal cover from cold nights. Again, same kind of reiterating some of the things we talked about. At best, they're gonna maintain weight and likely lose weight over winter. And when they try to go down to that low elevation, that's where we tend to see this human conflict or just kind of competition for space, I should say. So to kind of highlight some of those issues, this is a map, again, of that Hood River or Hood Wildlife Management Unit. Hood River itself is all the way up here in the corner. This is Highway 35 coming down. Anything in the green values is showing lower elevation, whereas yellow and red, this is Mount Hood right here, super high elevation values. So deer in this area, we have a couple different migration patterns, but some of the deer by Mount Defiance will actually go down into the gorge for the winter. We actually have a lot of deer that winter right along I-84 there in the forest. And then another big wintering area is this drainage over here is Eagle Creek. And it actually goes way back up in here. There's a lot of deer that go down in there to spend the winter as well. But the vast majority all are trying to get down into the Hood River basin, basically. And so then just to overlay that and start to think about this, here are the land ownerships of kind of the major, at least public landowners. So anything that's not covered in one of these colors is private land. And this kind of magenta, I'm colorblind, so this is challenging, but
Tan.
tan color, that's federal lands, the U.S. Forest Service ownership. The lighter blue there is all owned by Hood River County. Or so you can see, when you look at that lower elevation, we basically have Middle Mountain here in the middle, and that's really the big public land at lower elevation. This, if you get, well, I'm sure you guys are all familiar, this is owned by Green Diamond now, so that's all industrial timber. And then kind of the other thing to overlay on top of it, so this kind of purple color here, this is a land cover data set showing all the agricultural land or orchard land in the Hood River Valley. You can see we're kind of getting a smaller and smaller box that those deer have to spend time where they're not going to cause any sort of conflict. So when I zone in on it and think about it, these are kind of the areas, at least in the main Hood River Valley area, that we have for deer to overwinter, where they're not going to cause any issues. So one of the big things that I deal with are orchard conflicts. So I'm probably going to repeat a bunch of things most of you already know, but they're at lower elevation here in the Hood River Valley. They provide a high quality food resource. So as we talked about deer browsers, they like those stems and leaves, and guess what? That's exactly what orchards are. Those orchards as well are also highly susceptible for browsing, so they're biting off the buds, which are the part that all the orchards want to hang on to, because that's where the fruit's coming from. The management strategies that have been historically kind of deployed over the Hood River Valley are fencing, so trying to keep the deer from getting into those areas. That does cause other challenges in terms of migration paths. So if anything wanted to go across the valley or go up the hill, sometimes that can act as a barrier, in addition to keeping them out of those orchards. Some folks have lots with various repellents. The other one that I don't have on here is hazing. So some orchardists spend time going out and chasing the deer out or chasing the elk out. But the other one that we try to work on more and more, just creating high quality habitat at lower elevations that are not orchards. So working with Hood River County to have those openings and try to reduce other things that might keep deer out of there in the winter.
How high can the deer browse to on the tree?
High as they can reach. I mean, sometimes they'll get up on their hind legs to get up higher if they want to. Yeah, so that's the thing too, some of the older orchards actually have less impacted just because the deer have a harder time reaching, and also they're a little more decadent, not as tasty for deer, but really the young trees are where they get hammered. The other big conservation issue in the valley are recreation impacts. So as we're all aware, Hood River County is kind of a recreation mecca. Definitely has increased quite a bit with COVID. There's a lot of different, kind of when I think about outdoor recreation in terms of its impact on wildlife, there's a lot of different users and they all kind of have different levels of impact. So depending on the recreation type, I kind of have them listed in here in terms of, I guess not quite in terms of how they impact, but so on highway traffic, that's just forest roads, people traveling from A to B. OHVs, off-highway vehicles, so that's your ATVs, mountain motorbikes, that kind of stuff. Mountain bikes. And then hiking. So usually we tend to think of hiking or on highway traffic to be the least impactful. Mountain bikes, getting up there, and then OHVs typically, or at least from what we've seen with other studies, are the most impactful to big game species.
Joggers.
Oh.
Yeah, I'd put them in the hiking category, but yes. So volume of use, that's another thing that can impact it, you know, maybe hiking's not that big a deal, but what if you have 100 hikers a day walking the trail? That's a whole lot different than 1 or 2. So I kind of tend to think of those as dispersed versus developed. So ones where there's fewer people versus developed, it's kind of like a beacon saying, come here and spend time. And then timing of that recreation. So there's different impacts in summer versus winter. In summer, there's impacts, but deer tend to have higher elevations and more places they can spread out. In winter, they're a little bit more restricted just because of the snow loading. This is a good diagram I found, was actually out of Steamboat, Colorado, but it used a lot of data from studies done here in Oregon by the US Forest Service in the state of Oregon. We've done a lot of research out in Starkey on this exact issue. And it does talk about elk, but the same goes for deer. I would say you could think of some of these lines as being maybe less impactful for deer. But kind of this lighter blue line, it shows the distance where elk may take flight, so that you're basically anywhere from, let's say, 875 yards to 437 yards from and moving a car going through a forest road, or elk might take flight. Versus distance that elk actively keep away from an area. So again, you can see the impact of a car versus hikers being a little bit further. Mountain biking and other non-motorized use up to 640 yards, so it's kind of a goofy number, but that's almost a mile. And then ATVs and dirt roads within a forest, the use of that boy, I'm trying to figure it on the fly, that's almost a mile and a half, mile and 3/4. So as you can see, those ATVs are kind of the biggest impact.
What's the light blue, dark blue, just showing the range?
So it's showing the distance where they may take flight versus where they basically are avoiding it completely.
Oh, okay.
So you can see in general, like at least within a 1/4 mile or so, they're avoiding it, you know, depending on kind of the average across all theirs, they're just avoiding that area completely. And again, it's a general rule, like if there's only a few people going down a trail, it has less impact than say, you know, 20 or 30. So kind of coming back to our view of the Hood River Valley and put some of this in context. So this is just showing this next picture is just showing, the federal lands, the US Forest Service lands. This is a ranger district, so basically we're to be that Green Diamond chunk and Hood River Valley is kind of like up in here. This is kind of an analysis I did. We took all the Forest Service roads and just saw how far on the forest, how many areas are at least, this one on the left is a 1/4 mile from roads. So anything in white is at least a 1/4 mile from a road. Anything in gray is within a 1/4 mile of a road, and anything in this red is a wilderness area. And then when you go on the right, that's a 1/2 mile per road. So as you remember from that diagram, pretty much within a 1/4 mile, most things avoid those areas for the most part. I guess I qualify that the Forest Service roads layer isn't necessarily the most accurate. I'm sure that some of those roads are completely undrivable at this point, so it's not maybe as bad as it looks on here. But the big take home message, there's some numbers on the bottom there, but basically, if you go all the way out to a 1/2 mile on the entire forest, at least 70% of the entire national forest falls within a 1/2 mile of some sort of road. So there's a lot of area out there that's impacted by just recreation use or people driving those roads. And then the other thing I'll draw your attention to is this is one of the areas I highlighted as kind of a spot where it's like, okay, this might be a good place for deer and elk to be in the winter. If you're locally familiar, that's kind of one of our big mountain biking trail centers. So this is just, I mean, it's really hard to see in here, but this is basically the Hood River County's map of all their trails. And basically, any of these lines on here that aren't in the grid are all either roads, mountain bike trails, or OHV trails. So there's not a lot of space for deer and elk to spend in areas where we'd like to see them. They're not causing harm to orchards, they're up in the forest. But they do get pushed out of that area quite a bit. So that's kind of my talk. I just kind of wanted to highlight a couple of those issues, but in conclusion, based on some of our surveys, we have more deer than we previously thought. We actually thought we had closer to 700. We've got, looks like upwards of 1,000.
And that's just hood unit, right?
Just from the hood, yeah.
I think that's an underestimate personally, but.
Yeah, and I feel the same way. We didn't include, a lot of the private land that also has a bunch of deer on it. The other one I mean, hopefully to come away with this talk is monitoring black-tailed deer is really hard. We don't have great methods. We do put numbers out there, but they're definitely based on harvest or just feel as opposed to actual, repeatable, ways to do this. Then the Hood River Valley faces many conservation issues. Biggest ones, winter range loss, orchard conflict, and then those recreation impacts. I don't think it's all doom and gloom though. I think the biggest thing I just want people to take away from it is that, you know, there are impacts to each of these and just consider those when we want to put a new mountain bike trail out there. We want to expand our orchard somewhere, or we just want to build a house. Just kind of keeping those in the back of your head as you're out there. Yeah, I'm happy to take any questions. I breezed through a lot of that, so good chat.
You didn't mention much about the relationship of deer and wolves.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think there will be most of Oregon, west side, east side, there'll be more and more wolves everywhere.
Mhm.
So then you're gonna get more pressure from hunters to get rid of the wolves. And I'm familiar with some of the issues in northeastern Oregon and eastern Washington. Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife has a strong relationship for production for hunters.
Mhm.
So as the wolves build up, where do you see your agency having that balancing?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a challenge. I guess at least in terms of deer, the lucky thing is that they tend to be harder on the elk. That's their preferred prey base. Another thing that's kind of unique about us is compared to Northeast Oregon, we have way less elk. You know, once you get over into the coast range, that's where we have higher densities, at least in the western half of the state. So as much as I do think, I mean, we have wolves somewhat locally here down closer to like Warm Springs Indian Reservation. I don't think that we're going to be able to support a large population of wolves, at least locally, just because we don't have a prey base. Like we do have elk, but they're pretty sporadic. If anybody, 100 here, they're pretty hard. They can be really hard to find in the area. So I guess in terms of that, I don't see the wolves locally being a big impact. In terms of your question about just how the agency will kind of balance that out. I think at least, you know, the hunting thing, we're used to dealing with cranky hunters. One way or another, we either have too many animals or not enough, or not big enough ones, a bunch of small ones. So we're used to that side. I think the harder thing with wolves is dealing with livestock producers. Just because they do have a direct impact on their livelihood, and that's where, at least in Northeast Oregon, we've had a lot of challenges. So yeah, I think that, you know, as a biologist, I guess I'd like to say, I think I want to have everything out there. I want everybody to be happy about it too. So it's like trying to make that balance of how many wolves we get to a certain point. Is there such a thing as too many wolves? Is there such a thing as too many deer and elk? Will they hopefully balance each other out? Can we minimize conflicts that are not, I guess, hunting based, more of that livestock concern?
Holly has a question.
I got a question. Hey, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm thinking of the Post Canyon area, and I'm wondering what your opinion is on seasonal closures, if it's such a winter, if a winter closure for recreation and travel in that area. I know it wouldn't be that popular, but what is your opinion on that? Recreation is only gonna get more and more intense around here.
Yeah, yeah,
How
I guess.
useful do you think that would be, assuming it was feasible politically?
I think it'd be super helpful. It's definitely an area, again, when they're coming down lower elevation, that'd be great to have a spot where they're not disturbed and they're not in orchards, so. I
So
mean, I think,
what months would you say, what time frame for a winter closure, recreation closure for Post Canyon, what would be the time frame?
we don't have great information on timing of migration for blacktail, but for the White River, we tend to see deer migrating at the end of October, down to winter range. I think here it might be even later just based on snowfall. So if it were a perfect world and I could just wave a magic wand, it'd probably be like 1st of December through 1st of April, end of March time frame.
I'll write that down.
Well, I've talked with the county and some of the recreation folks. It's definitely building, I think the challenge is building buy-in from the recreationalists.
Yes, wouldn't that be
that's-
great, though?
Yeah, I think it's possible locally from our local recreationists. It's just we have a lot of folks that come from out of town too, and
Right.
trying to get that out to them is a little bit harder.
I mean, other areas use closures, for certain areas. I know I've seen it in Mount Hood. I forget the area. I've seen it over in, there's a state park a new state park on the east side. And there's a certain area that I think it's for Golden Eagle or something, where it's a closure, It seems to make a lot of sense, in the winter, it's just eroding it's a lot of erosion and all that
Yeah.
stuff.
Well, I think you get buy-in from recreationalists. I know locally mountain bikers really don't like when people ride muddy trails, ruins the trail,
Yeah,
so.
yeah,
There's a potential to have some common ground, I think, with them too.
yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
Watershed group.
I have a question about herbicides impact on deer forage and forage.
Yeah,
It's widely used in the forest and it's used to to stop the brush and other vegetation competing with the new seedling. So you also mentioned that the deer herds decreased over time. And I remember, clear cutting increased dramatically after World War II on private and state lands, and to a certain extent in federal lands. And so there's been a lot of elimination of some of that high quality forage that you're talking about. And so what's your take on the impacts of widespread, herbicide use and spraying on high quality forage for deer?
yeah, I wish I could change it, to be completely honest, with the forest practices, because I think, again, I'm not a forester, so I don't know, but historically, I believe they burned a lot more after they got done harvesting, which was great, because that's the natural thing, it does that nutrient release, and you do get a lot of those shrubs and plants growing back that they wanna browse on. The herbicide stuff is definitely not a good deal, like those clear cuts do become productive for deer, but usually it takes longer. And there's actually situations where they'll nibble on little dug fur, and then they get complain about eating the only thing that's left, is dug fur or whatever's out there, so. I'm in a perfect world, I understand why foresters do it, or why timber harvest, they wanna do it, but in a perfect world, you'd rather burn underneath it.
So we talk about predators, way more of an impact on wolves now, or black bears and cougars. Cougars which eat all and any deer, that they can catch, and bears, fawns mainly, I would assume. But there's those populations have increased here in River County over the years.
Yeah, and that's another one that's really hard to get a good handle on, population estimate wise, and that's another thing the cameras might be able to help us out with too, is trying to track those cougar numbers, but yeah, cougars are definitely the predator for deer. That's their.
And what I've noticed after 60 years or 50 years of living in prime deer habitat on the east side, people always think the wilderness areas, pristine areas up high, that's the Shangri-La where all the wildlife are. Not. There's less food, it's high elevation, it's marginal habitat, there's more predators. deer are hanging out in my neighbor's yard because there's not predators, not many predators.
Yeah, there's definitely
They're
some
coming
that
down
figure
to
that out.
urban areas on the edge,
Yeah.
the edge of where it's been logged, where the forage is good.
Yep.
That's where they're living here.
Oh, yeah, some of them avoid, so yeah, that's another thing I didn't even touch on, there are different migration history strategies where some won't migrate at all because they've got everything they need right in one little area.
They do need water, and 2 years ago, when we had the major drought on the east side, the elk and deer left the whole east side. They went over the ridge and over towards Moser, where there's a few springs.
Yep.
The first, one of the first and only times in my life that's happened.
Yeah, they're good at, they'll find the
Strange.
water where it's at, they're used to having to seek that out.
Okay, we're probably only have one or two more questions.
I just wanted to add that, ODF has you're looking on a mule deer management plan.
Yeah,
And that's online in totality, because aren't you about ready to?
they're taking these comments and trying to finalize, like,
That
glad you
is
brought that up.
excellent information, and the other thing is ODF put out a publication called Migration Matters,
Mhm.
and that's really excellent.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought both of those up. Yeah, if anybody has comments on deer management at the moment, we are in the process of revamping our plan that tells us what we're gonna shoot for in the next 2 years or so.
And thank you for your excellent presentation. That's a great job.
I'm just wondering, I gotta notice that, Hood River County, is looking at trying to get $40,000 from the state to sort of control bears, cougars, deer, et cetera, et cetera. There's a program, they can get $40,000 to work on that, do you know?
Hood River County is trying to get money from.
There's some sort of state program, and I don't have a lot of details on it, but
Sure, I guess I'm aware that Wildlife Services used to lobby the county to get some money for that sort of thing. I guess I'm not familiar with what you're talking about.
That was on
I
the
think
agenda
that's what
very
you're talking
recently.
Is that it? Okay.
Yeah.
As I understand, that's Wildlife, so Wildlife Service is a federal agency and they're basically out to help landowners deal with various wildlife conflict issues, so whether it's deer getting into orchards, cougars eating sheep, wolves eating cattle, that kind of thing. Those folks are there to basically help mitigate those conflicts. I will say that the Wildlife Services person who I think is, at least he said that, told me that he's the one working on getting, funding from Hood River County. Pretty good guy, like I actually will call him, at least to have landowners have a resource for somebody to reach out to if they do have issues. We usually try to deal with them non-lethally, but there's definitely times where, especially I think the one that's really challenging here in Hood River is bears. We do get bears getting into garbage, and once they've gotten into it several times and get habituated to it, it becomes a human safety concern. So usually it's trying to mitigate that ahead of time, but, those folks do come in handy when you do have to do lethal on people.
can I have one more?
Steve, did you have a question? Steve Gribble? No, I didn't. I thought you raised his hand.
No, I was just gesturing wildly. Other than to thank Andrew for his presentation.
I had one thing that, there's something that's come up in the past. A lot of the projects that we help the irrigation districts do, especially East Fork Irrigation District, is converting the remaining open canals to pipeline.
Mhm.
And some of the feedback, there's some public feedback that people are really concerned that eliminating that canal as a water source for wildlife is a big issue. Could you just really briefly speak to that issue?
Yeah, I guess in terms of the, like, kind of went through a whole slide presentation there of all the issues that we deal with deer, like, I feel like that's one of the lowest priorities for me in terms of like water. It's the time of year that we would expect, kind of like you mentioned, with water to be an impact, to be late summer, early fall. And just like you mentioned, deer are really good at finding resources or getting to places with water. They also do get a lot of water through their diet as well as metabolic water, which they convert after they eat the food. So, yeah, I would say that if that's a concern for not doing that, I don't think that that's having a large impact. Like adding water to an area is great, but deer are pretty good at finding resources, if one disappears.
And that's consistent with what, Jeremy, your predecessor
Yeah.
said that multiple times, but I thought since we were having a talk on deer, in the Hood River and it's reported, just to kind of note that has been,
Yeah.
that you guys do consider it and you don't consider it a threat to.
No, I don't, again, there's a
And the
lot of
deer
threats to
population.
deer and that one's probably, if anything, very bad.
Okay.
Think about this last winter when we had 0 and negative temperatures all over. Did you see any water around? I never, everything's frozen solid.
Mm,
Even the sloughs on the Columbia.
mm,
Can they eat snow? Where do they get water when it's like that?
A lot of
weeks,
it's,
it's
I mean, a
like
lot of it's coming through their metabolism.
Mm.
They're metabolizing fat and food, whatever food they're getting. That's where they're.
That's the
surviving
thing
off
that's
that.
amazed me when we get those extended bitter cold
it's worse.
weeks of that.
Yeah,
How are they getting water?
yeah.
Think
When you
about-
metabolize fat, you create water. Water.
Think of all the places that deer and elk live that are way, way colder. You know,
Oh,
it
yeah.
never gets around here in the winter time,
Mhm.
and they survive.
Oh, yeah, they do great.
Okay, well, if you've got another question, ask after we break up, but considering we're a half hour over, what the scheduled time was, which I don't think anyone's really complaining, but,
Yeah.
we need to.